Hi, everyone. Big welcome to today's webinar on defending claims in consumer health. My name is Mary Beckwith, co-founder and co-CEO here at Lindus Health, and I'm hosting the session. And the background of the session is today's consumer health market. Clinical evidence is an increasingly important differentiator to help leading brands and companies stand out from the crowd. Consumers are increasingly savvy, health conscious, and it's just part of the broader trend we've seen around consumerization of healthcare. So we'll be exploring practical ways which leading consumer health companies can help differentiate their products through evidence and how to conduct that robust evidence without sacrificing speed. So not just going down a traditional pharma route. And with that, I am going to hand over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Thomas, do you want to go first?
Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Gurry. I'm a gut microbiome scientist by training, come from an academic research background, and specifically starting in computational biology, then focusing on the gut microbiome and how it breaks down dietary fiber, which ultimately led to some research that resulted in spinning out a company that we call Myota, where we make precision prebiotic blends.
Awesome. Malcolm, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. I'm Malcolm Fogarty. I'm a strategic advisor at Lindus Health, focused on consumer health and strategic partnerships. My background's in consumer health innovation at GSK Consumer Health and Haleon, where we built digital health ventures, VMS brands, and RX to OTC switch brands. And my focus today is how evidence becomes a commercial advantage, moving from clinically tested to truly defensible claims that build trust and ultimately drive growth.
Excellent. And yeah, thank you both so much for joining us. And I already did my intro at the start, but maybe just a word on Lindus Health. So we help companies run faster, more reliable clinical trials and studies. We are quite active in the consumer health space. So we've helped quite a number of companies now run end-to-end clinical studies, everything from protocol design all the way through to results analysis and closeout. So what I wanted to start with, I'd love to just set the stage talking a little bit about Myota, Thomas, and your approach to evidence, because I think you guys have a really interesting product and your brand and company has always put evidence at front and center. Would you be able just to talk us through kind of Myota's journey around clinical evidence, what evidence-based means for Myota, and of course, what your product does?
Absolutely, with pleasure, thanks. So essentially, Myota began in the lab when we were studying how the gut microbiome ferments dietary fiber. For those of you who aren't familiar with that process, basically it's one of the core functionalities of the gut microbiome to break down dietary fiber and prebiotic fiber in particular, and ferment it into what are called short-chain fatty acids, which are, it's a bit of a mouthful, but they're the main effectors from the microbiome on our health and physiology. They're anti-inflammatory, they maintain low levels of chronic inflammation, contribute to healthy glucose homeostasis and essentially a healthy metabolism in general, and all sorts of knock-on effects from there. Increasingly, we're seeing links with neurodegeneration, with inflammation-mediated mental health conditions, and a lot of things that really put the microbiome in a very important role. And what's really fascinating about the microbiome and what motivated me to spin this out into Myota is that there's an opportunity for impact through diet, actually. Prebiotic fiber is a safe intervention, but it can have clinical impact that is really significant and measurable in clinical trials. So that's where we've positioned ourselves. We've positioned ourselves as a company that puts science first. As I say, we started in the lab, studied the differences between people and their ability to break down fiber in great detail. The key point being that, as I'm sure many of you realize, we all have a unique gut microbiome, as referenced as a unique fingerprint in many cases. And what that means in the context of what I'm talking about is that we can ferment the same fiber more or less effectively into short-chain fatty acids, which ultimately means that despite what we know about fiber and short-chain fatty acids, if you put a single fiber on clinical trial, you don't see the kind of results that you would expect from the science. Not nearly as strong, let's say. And that's because only a subset of individuals can actually break it down. So what we did is we built an end-to-end lab pipeline where we studied that in great detail to build blends of fibers that account for this inter-individual variability so that we can combine fibers in a way that maximizes the efficacy across different microbiome makeups. The key point being then that we can then follow, if you like, traditional evidence-based clinical path where we test it as a single intervention against a placebo and collect clinical grade evidence about the impacts it has on health-related biomarkers, which I think is increasingly important to customers out there, but also really a key part of the opportunity of reintroducing fiber into the diets, particularly Western diets, which, as we all know, has become impoverished in dietary fiber with concomitant effects on chronic disease prevalence and also just the general impoverishment of the microbiome. So we're really about putting our money where our mouth is and testing our blends of fibers and products in clinical trials and really showing that they have an impact, because at the end of the day, I think marketing's important, but science wins out.
Yeah, great, great mic drop moment. And so yeah, so we'll go into your history with evidence generation in a lot more depth, including discussing some of the very interesting results from the Flora study. So we know, obviously, I think we all know the score that consumers are kind of increasingly paying attention to health claims and any data that supports them. We know from general surveys that a large percentage of consumers have kind of stopped using a product for lack of clear information or evidence. I'd also be curious for Malcolm and Thomas, your views. Have you noticed this in your own experiences? Are you hearing this from the voice of the customer or customer feedback? Well, what does it tell us about today's consumers?
I think, as you said earlier, consumers are simply savvier. They're comparing products online. They're checking ingredients, asking where's the proof, and if they don't see clear evidence, they either don't buy or they switch. So, from a brand perspective, I'd go so far as to say that evidence is now part of the brand experience. So this shift is forcing big companies to update data generation, and smaller brands can now compete by being faster and more transparent. So it's not just something hidden, as in evidence, not just something hidden in a dossier anymore. It's something consumers expect to see, understand, and ultimately trust, which is key at the end of the day when it comes to health and healthcare.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely been my experiences. For reference, I didn't really realize that about the consumer base when we started Myota. I was coming at it from a scientific lens and thinking this would be useful. It's actually been a very interesting part of the journey to realize that people are increasingly not only scientifically literate, but looking for that evidence base, which I think is a very good thing. And possibly, I'm not a big fan of social media, but I do think it has something to do with the fact that there are some serious opinion leaders that have a voice now that are able to distill science and communicate it to the public in a way that there are trusted voices out there that are actually able to give them a synthesis of what the situation is, and they increasingly look to measure that against what they're seeing in the market. So it's a very interesting time to be involved in this space for sure.
We talked about it, Mary, on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, particularly with social media being a bit of a double-edged sword, and we've all heard about the kind of vitamins or supplement swindle, so to speak, where there's choice paralysis and just a plethora of different products and solutions out there, and it's difficult for consumers to choose, and therefore they're turning to experts, as you said, Thomas, be that online or in the pharmacist, which is fantastic. But it just goes to show that you need to have clear, demonstrable, kind of science-backed evidence to truly win over consumers who are becoming much more scientifically literate, as you said, and expectations are shifting, particularly when consumers may be signing up to subscriptions or membership, which obviously they're putting their hand in the pocket. They want to make sure that there's true efficacy behind the products of the supplements, or even indeed the kind of digital health products as well that they may be subscribing to. So it's only a good thing. The challenge with media and social media is increasingly there's more and more potential confusion. So it's our job and the job of the brands to really instill trust and make sure that they're getting the most efficacious products and services, solutions that they need and that are right for them.
I mean, if you think about it, if you really break it down, right? Like, unlike a drug, you don't have a physician prescribing and mediating the interaction with the product. And so you need to close that trust gap, if you like, by providing additional evidence that sits in place of a physician, literally prescribing you to take the drug. On that, Thomas, as an emerging brand in the space, when did you decide that consumer perception data wouldn't be enough? And when did you decide to go through more rigorous clinical validation?
Yeah, I mean, so interestingly, from the get-go, my motivation and the early team members' motivation was to build something that actually contributed to this fiber gap that we're seeing and the microbiome problem, as well as just dealing with this massive chronic disease epidemic that's bankrupting the healthcare system. So I think we were coming at it from the perspective of scientific evidence and public health, without realizing that actually consumers are where they are, and think that it was a learning experience to realize that actually we were playing at the right time, because while there was still a bit of education needed in the market about what prebiotics were and what their role was in health and how the microbiome and fiber interact for our health, there was increasingly this, basically expectation from the part of customers that they wanted to see this kind of clinical evidence and scientific backing behind products. So obviously that's a good thing for us, but I think more broadly, it just validated the strategy that if you stay close to science, provided you have an adequate business model, and let's not discount that, that is important. It is business at the end of the day. And if you can't make it work from that perspective, then the science is moot. But if you can, then science is like the best foundation on which to rest, because ultimately then you can gain trust, and not to mention that it's much easier to defend yourself. I think it was Mark Twain that said that the advantage of never lying is that you don't have to remember anything, or something like that.
Yeah, nice. Malcolm, from your perspective and background, how do larger companies think about evidence when choosing to partner with or even acquire, emerging companies or brands?
I guess it's almost like a litmus test. So larger consumer health companies, or at least from my experience at GSK Consumer Health and Haleon, was that we would screen startups by evidence maturity. So credible design, validated endpoints, transparent data, and certainly a clean evidence package shortens due diligence and signals kind of scalability, which ultimately is what we'd be looking for in terms of any brands or products that we'd be looking to acquire or indeed partner with in the first instance. So yeah, I think it reduces risk, it speeds up internal approvals, and often shortens, as I said, the kind of the due diligence, which is key on both sides.
Thanks. I'm not going to dwell on this. I think if you've been operating in the space a while, I think most folks will have an intuitive sense for this. But maybe, Malcolm, I just go to you again. How would you kind of summarize the differences between a kind of typical trial run for a consumer health product, maybe to substantiate health claims, versus a more traditional pharmaceutical grade kind of drug trial? And what are some of the frequent problems that occur when you don't bear these differences in mind?
Well, ultimately, I think pharma proves efficacy under kind of ideal conditions, and consumer health proves performance under real world conditions. So, copying pharma typically tends to lead to kind of over-engineered trials and ultimately cost.
Yeah.
Which I think was kind of top of the poll, from what I remember. So the goal is really kind of fit for purpose. So the kind of the lightest design that holds up scientifically and regulatorily, I guess would be my summary. And I think, again, going back to where we started talking and working together, was making sure that there was kind of fit for purpose design and evidence generation for what myself and my team were doing at Haleon, where kind of pharma grade trials, just as I said, weren't really fit for purpose, and I certainly didn't have the budget or indeed the time to entertain those type of trials.
Yeah. And Thomas, I guess we'll maybe this is a good segue. Would love to hear from you what medical grade evidence means for a company like Myota, and maybe over the next couple of slides we can talk about how you achieve this without pharma scale budgets and timelines. So maybe if you start by talking through what medical grade evidence looks like, and then we can go into more detail about EFSA.
Absolutely. So it's a great question because in many respects, medical grade evidence just looks like pharma trials. It's just that the key difference, as Malcolm said, is that it happens in a real world setting and also critically with healthy populations. So the difference there being that often it's harder to get a signal in healthy people, especially with an intervention that's not a drug or a therapeutic per se. But key point being that I think that otherwise the core principles remain, making sure that you're comparing against placebo, or if that's not possible, an adequate level of control, controlling all the variables you can, and being clear about what you can't control and what might be confounding your data. Essentially, just core scientific principles remain true. And in fact, the difference of the real world evidence part is, in my view, actually really important and interesting, because even in pharma, that's part of the journey. Once you become approved, then there's real world evidence that kicks in.
Yeah.
And that's really important because people don't necessarily adhere to a treatment regimen as it's spelled out, or they experience longer term side effects, things like that, that ultimately you can really learn a lot from, as well as people's motivations and behavior. So I actually kind of view it as a slightly broader framework than the pharma study, which is as controlled as it possibly can be. But otherwise, the core principles remain the same.
Yeah, got it. And so, yeah, would love for you to maybe summarize Myota's evidence generation journey so far. And I know that you guys chose to pursue this EFSA health claim. So yeah, if you could summarize the evidence generation journey so far, then maybe talk a little bit about what an EFSA health claim is and why Myota choose to pursue it.
For sure. So in terms of the evidence collection, I think one of the key points is that we started with ex vivo or in vitro studies of the microbiome, which is particularly well suited to the microbiome. Actually, it works quite well in the lab. It's not perfect, but certainly allows you to make a lot of progress in the lab before you actually go to humans. So we spent a long time doing that and getting our blend of fibers and our intervention or product, or however you want to call it, in a place where we were as confident about the possible efficacy as we could be based on the science. After which, the key difference from pharma is that we're talking about fibers here. We're talking about something that's generally recognized as safe and that you can immediately administer to people. Much easier to do in human trials without going through extensive toxicity studies or animal studies or anything like that, which would largely be a huge waste of time, actually, because those models aren't necessarily that useful at the end of the day. And besides, we can skip that step. So we went right away to clinical trials from there and started testing it in people, but more broadly with a two-pronged approach, one in the sort of rigorous randomized control trial kind of framework, and on the other hand, collecting even fuzzier, if you like, real-world evidence from customers that are buying the product and using it as they see fit in the doses they like, however frequently they want. We also deployed a microbiome testing kit in our customer base to see how their microbiomes were changing in people who were actually consuming our fibers versus those who weren't. So lots of different approaches, but the key point being that we were able to go right to humans. And this kind of brings on the point of EFSA, which we've always used as North Star. Of course, it is the regulatory framework that oversees food-associated health claims, and us being a food or supplement, depending on how you want to call us. At the end of the day, we answer to them and not the EMA or anything like that, unlike the FDA that groups the two together in the United States. The reason why we pursued EFSA isn't just because we operate out of the UK first. We are now an ingredient that's sold in the US as well. We are holding ourselves accountable to the EFSA standard simply because it's perhaps the most rigorous standard out there in terms of obtaining health claims. They're notoriously highly conservative. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It can be very helpful for customers to navigate a pretty noisy marketplace where claims can be a bit outlandish. That being said, it does make it really hard to obtain differentiated health claims and talk about the health benefits of your product. So we followed that standard, for one, because we believe that our product was efficacious enough that we could obtain an NFC health claim at the end of the day, but also because if you shoot for the moon, even if you miss, you land amongst the stars, or whatever cliche it was, like the other regulatory frameworks fall out along the way. For example, the structure function claims that can be obtained from the FDA have a lower bar, not an absolutely low bar that's easy to pass. You need clinical grade evidence, but it's a lower bar than EFSA, where you need multiple confirmatory large scale studies to demonstrate even a small health benefit. So that's why we shot for it, because at the end of the day, it is a pretty high bar, but if you aim that high, then everything else kind of falls into place naturally.
Yep, makes sense. Am I right in thinking that EFSA is fairly unique in giving you exclusivity over making a novel health claim? Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Provided you have some kind of ownership over your ingredient, which tends to be one of the challenges for a lot of people. Is that let's say if you get a health claim for oats, well, that's hard to defend and make proprietary. So they do reward the effort put in.
Yep.
But you do need some kind of intellectual property position, or some kind of position that allows you to at least be the only seller of your product.
Makes sense. There's not a huge amount, just from our experience, there isn't a huge amount of recognition of, EFSA as a potential pathway. So I thought it would be interesting to highlight. But would also love to talk about the Flora trial, which we worked on as well. So this was the kind of first major study, right, that has you on the EFSA health claim path. So yeah, would love to explore this a little bit. Would love to hear some of your thought process behind the design for that. And then we'll hopefully kind of tease out learnings that can be applied to other similar studies. Thomas, would love to hear how you came up with the study design, in particular, the overall objective, and then how you thought about selecting study endpoint.
Absolutely. So here, our objective was to demonstrate what we were confident in terms of the benefits of prebiotic fiber. There are multiple mechanisms by which fiber in general, and prebiotic fiber specifically, impact the diabetic process and essentially glucose metabolism, which is, a massive problem. I mean, I think the NHS spends £1 million an hour on diabetes, is the statistic that I heard. It's pretty unbelievable. And I mean, it's not in all cases, but often largely preventable. And so it's also something that you can reverse and you can catch relatively early. So we wanted to study endpoints that were relevant to the diabetic process, but then had to match that against regulatory expectations as to what kind of endpoints they look for here. And in fact, Lindus was super helpful in helping us navigate that in terms of what is the right kind of endpoint and what are the expectations from regulators, EFSA, FDA, and all regulators, actually. HbA1c being a critical one, for example, that may not speak to the average customer, but certainly is very important for regulators in demonstrating that you're having an impact on the diabetic process. So that's what kind of guided our choice of endpoints. Another key point to note about the Flora trial is that since we're targeting a food-associated health claim and the EFSA pathway, but more broadly just health claims in general in the food space, you have to deal with populations that aren't diseased, and you can't mention a disease in the claim. Mm-hmm. So it was important that we chose people that, while relevant to the diabetes endpoints, that meaning, if we picked people that were eating 50 grams of fiber a day, were lean and exercising a lot and had no history of diabetes, we'd be very hard to show any effect from anything, frankly, drug or otherwise. But on the other hand, we can't work with people with type 2 diabetes, not for a food claim. Not to say that we don't expect there'd be impact there, but we're talking about regulatory constraints here. And so pre-diabetics were the range that are, at least in the EFSA framework, still considered healthy from a regulatory perspective, but also are on the path to type 2 diabetes, and so are a relevant population to be targeting. And this was actually what guided our inclusion criteria, but also essentially what were the kind of endpoints that we were looking at, and ultimately looking at various endpoints like HbA1c, but also insulin sensitivity and even inflammation and other secondary endpoints that might be relevant here as well.
It's super interesting. And to both of your earlier points, we run phase 2, 3, and 4 studies in metabolic health, type 2 diabetes, weight loss. You're basically looking at the same endpoints, right?
Right, exactly.
It's just that, the inclusion criteria is slightly different. Super interesting. And Malcolm, I'd also be curious for your perspective, in consumer health, how do the kind of maybe other examples of how like the end claims you're trying to make influence endpoint selection and inclusion and exclusion criteria?
I guess in summary, my tip would be start with the claim verb, like it supports or it reduces or improves. So each kind of dictates the endpoint selection. So, successful studies balance kind of clinical validity and commercial readiness or relevance rather. So ultimately, the kind of endpoints and the inclusion exclusion should mirror the claim would be my kind of tip. Yeah. Again, based on experience.
Nice. We actually have a couple of questions here that I'm going to try and thread in. So Anon asks, can you build IP, I think in the context of EFSA, can you build IP around formulations or existing ingredients? So maybe Thomas, I'll go to you for this.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So you can build IP around formulations. That's certainly the approach we've taken, but I think that it's somewhat complicated because the formulation itself has to be non-obvious and inventive, right? To use sort of like IP terminology. And this is the hard part because then you have to basically prove or demonstrate that there's no evidence in the existing literature or prior art that like indicates that you could use these things as a formulation. It's not obvious to an expert in the field that you could just combine things in this way to get the benefit. So essentially, there has to be some kind of inventiveness in that process, which is pretty difficult in the context of food. That being said, there are caveats to that, which aren't actually relevant to our journey because we really had this kind of approach of really studying, coming at it from the microbiome's angle and studying a lot of the properties of the microbiome and their fermentation capabilities in order to build that formulation. And that's the basis of our IP. But in other cases, there are recipe equivalent patents that have some validity as well. There you enter into a more nebulous territory where there are use cases and things, and slightly out of my ability to comment on with any expertise. But certainly the short answer is yes, you can use formulations to an extent to get around that ingredient problem.
And another follow-up question, also from Anonymous, maybe the same person. What were the steps you took to get the EFSA health claim, and how did you determine the evidence threshold needed?
Right. So to be clear, we haven't yet submitted a dossier to EFSA. The regulatory expectations there are very high. You need not only multiple studies, but studies of various types. Generally, it helps to have supporting evidence from other studies and preclinical evidence. You need a pilot study to evaluate the effect size and potentially dosing, if that's a consideration in your case. And then you need at least one, if not two, larger confirmatory studies conducted in independent manners. So the bar is high and it takes some time. But we basically reverse engineered it from what's the expected outcome, what do we think that we can actually demonstrate, and then let's pick endpoints and populations that'll allow us to do that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And with that, we are going to discuss the results of this first Flora study. So this was published in the British Journal of Nutrition a few months ago. I think, it's a great case study for how impactful, your product can be along essentially a very similar set of endpoints to the kind of endpoints we see in a full-blown drug trial. I don't know, Thomas, if you want to just quickly narrate the results for the audience, the impact we saw, whether there were any surprises there, and just overall your thoughts on the results.
Yeah, absolutely. So as mentioned earlier, the sort of primary endpoint was the HbA1c levels as measured at 16 weeks, but also tested at 24 weeks post starting the intervention. And there, compared to a placebo, of course, what we found is that at the HbA1c level, we saw an overall effect, but a statistically significant effect in those who are earlier on in the diabetic process, so below 6% in technical parlance, but essentially those who are closest to the healthy state. So, which was actually surprising, because our assumption was that the further along you'd be, the more impactful it would be. And I don't think that that's necessarily to be ruled out, but it's there are various reasons why that might take longer if you're further along in the process. And so that was really interesting to us, because actually it highlighted the fact that we're ultimately positioning ourselves as a preventative strategy. And indeed, it shows that if you catch people early in the pre-diabetes journey through preventative healthcare in general, then actually it's very cost effective to bring them back to the healthy state. And we've shown that you can do that with something as simple as a fiber supplement. But then secondary endpoints being lipids and insulin sensitivity and inflammation. And we showed actually statistically significant impacts on insulin sensitivities across the cohort, which is important because that's the underlying mechanism that's driving essentially other parts of the diabetic process, and even the ultimate endpoint of HbA1c, which is kind of the integrated average of blood sugar over time. And also we've shown reductions in systemic inflammation, which affects the diabetic process, but lots of other processes as well, consistent with the science. So those parts were expected. I think what was most surprising was the early on part, which was very interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also where the biggest segment of the market is, right? Super interesting. Now, obviously, probably for us and a lot of people on the call, these results make sense. But your average consumer, although they're more evidence savvy, they're not exactly going to have a subscription to the BJN. So how did you go about translating these results into consumer friendly messaging? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not easy because you have to be careful what you say. You can't talk about diabetes, for example, not in the context of your product. So I think that, it comes down to a matter of navigating a complex language game, where as well as what language people understand. So healthy blood sugar control and contributes to healthy blood sugar control is the kind of language that a lot of people understand. And so we've tended to use that kind of language, all the while also relying on education about the broader benefits of the microbiome and short-chain fatty acids in preventing diabetes, which we can talk about because that's actually not our product. That's actually a broader thing.
Yeah. So basically linking the product to essentially the fiber and like the direct physiological benefit, and then from there to diabetes prevention. Yeah, makes sense. And Malcolm, from your perspective, how useful are these results for a larger company evaluating partnerships, or maybe a retailer? Would they look at this?
I think from a partner point of view, whether that's, a retailer, an investor, or, bigger company you might want to partner with, particularly kind of talking to smaller companies, strong results don't just sit in a publication, as we just said, right? So they show up as, shorter conversations with medical and regulatory teams, faster listing decisions with retailers, which is ultimately critical, and more confidence on kind of price and positioning. So when you can show, in simple terms, this many people, for example, this time frame, this benefit, it changes the tone of the discussions completely. For any smaller companies, that's absolutely, as I said earlier, kind of critical to starting off on the right foot and putting themselves in a favorable position.
Nice. We have a question from Sean, who asks, will you be able to refer to this as a prebiotic in the EU, considering prebiotic is itself considered a health claim? So Thomas, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, that's a great and a difficult question, actually. This is a constantly moving bar. So, for example, the word probiotic is now not really allowed anymore in the UK. And I think this is kind of a difficult game to play. If you're trying to catch this all the time, I think you can get lost. So our approach has been to not worry too much about that. We have demonstrated prebiotic benefits in our trials, as in boosting the abundance of beneficial bacteria, which is the literal definition of prebiotic often used. And so bifidobacteria, lactobacillus, and so on. And so we've demonstrated those benefits. And we do have prebiotic fibers in there, which in that respect is something that we can refer to in some way. But we don't lean on that claim per se, because as you point out, it's something that's kind of a moving target and a bit difficult to follow, frankly.
Right. Thanks. So maybe trying to kind of tease out generalizable learnings from a study like the Flora study. So I can maybe start and then we'll turn it over to you guys. But we know the traditional pharma playbook doesn't work. We know there's an advantage, but there is an advantage to using similar endpoints, just conducting the study in a more real world setting. Obviously, Lindis, we ran a study together. We approached this by, okay, let's look at the study setting. So instead of, very traditional healthcare sites, we ran the study in more community care clinics. They're still fully capable of doing HbA1c, a blood draw for an HbA1c test and the sort of lipid and liver inflammation biomarkers. But it just helps make it a little bit more convenient for participants. That lowers cost, it reduces timelines as well. And then obviously using technology throughout on things like patient recruitment, and I can talk a little bit about how we did that in a second. Just again helps lower cost and increase timelines without really sacrificing scientific validity. So yeah, I mean, Thomas, are you able to talk about any other techniques or design tricks you employed in the study to help meet those objectives while also meeting cost and timeline considerations?
For sure. I mean, so that was something that we certainly collaborated with Lindis on very much and relied a lot on Lindis' expertise on recruitment there. But social media, for example, is one of the places that you can actually look for participants, particularly when you're talking about a broad population that doesn't need to be screened even at the level of the clinic until you then consent them into the study and really check their eligibility. So that's one thing. The other is obviously the distributed nature of either recruitment or the study itself. I think is generally an approach that has been super helpful to us, both in our in-house studies and in our studies that we've conducted in a more rigorous setting. The key 2 points being there that it obviously accelerates recruitment greatly, but it also makes the study more equitable. For example, we can recruit from Northern England, where it's a bit harder to recruit from typically compared to London, and it's relevant for real-world evidence to have actually more of an equitable recruitment strategy.
Yeah, awesome. And I remember for this study, we did the direct social media recruitment, but we also did referrals via EHRs. And the eligibility criteria are actually pretty difficult for this study, right? Because you're looking for, I can flick back, but you're looking for patients within a pretty narrow range of HbA1c. So it's a pre-diabetic range, so they literally won't have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. But HbA1c is quite variable. If you take the same blood from the same patient, same vial of blood, put it through two separate HbA1c readings, you're likely to get, plus minus a difference of, well, Thomas, you probably know better than me, but it's going to be significant, plus minus 0.3. And so that effectively narrows your actual window even further. And so what we did was we basically searched a stack of about 20 million electronic health records in the UK alone, which we can search. So we searched for people who'd had either, a recent HbA1c reading that was in that range, or had other diagnoses or prescriptions that suggested they might be in that pre-diabetic range, and then invited them for further screening. And that was quite helpful in this case. So yeah, I think, again, these are all techniques that we would equally employ in a drug study, but they can also be useful here to help reduce timelines and costs, again, without sacrificing scientific validity. We will move on just to the roadblocks here that we find with clinical studies like this. So we've kind of touched on some of the typical challenges that studies in this space face. Kind of like protocols that aren't really designed for the claim, study designs and execution that's much more suited for a pharma grade study, heavily involving clinical trial sites, full-on monitoring, etc. But my view is that people should be really demanding of their if they're working with a CRO, you should be really demanding of the CRO to find that balance between efficacy, validity, and cost and speed. Yeah, maybe Thomas, obviously, you chose to work with us. We're very thankful for that. But what were you looking for in a CRO partner, and what kind of drove your decision making? And maybe any red flags that you'd watch for in the consumer health space?
Absolutely. I think that probably everybody who's looking for a CRO partner has ability to recruit at speed in mind. And I think that's maybe an obvious one, but that was certainly something that we looked at, and, we're impressed with Lindis's capability there. But I think one of the things that was most important to us as a young company that was trying to navigate this really complex regulatory environment of the consumer health space is some kind of regulatory sensitivity and a conversation partner or even a sparring partner on that topic. Because as you point out on the slide, misalignment between the marketing and the science is actually just, it can make all the efforts worthless if you're not demonstrating something in a way that can be translated into an approved or allowable language or health claim. Then there's no point, really. You can talk about your study, but you're not going to get a health claim out of it. And so a CRO that understood that we weren't a drug, we were a food, and what we were trying to target there and how that was relevant, and willingness to work with us on that problem and the study design to make sure that it worked for our goals was really paramount. And I think that's one of the things that's really set us up for a success there. So that was critical to us.
Nice. Thank you. And yeah, Malcolm, from your perspective, why can companies default to more pharma grade designs? Is it because that's just, what their CROs are used to delivering or what their teams are used to delivering, or do people not know alternatives exist?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a combination of both, really. So a lot of the CROs are built around the pharma model. That's what their system and their playbooks and their commercial models are designed for, and that's what they offer by default. And again, that was my experience, and I needed an alternative. I needed something that was more agile and fit for purpose. When I was at Haleon and we started talking at Lindus. And on the brand side, teams often feel kind of safer copying a drug style approach, even when they're not trying to get a drug approved. It feels less risky on paper, and a lot of companies and individuals are risk averse, but it ultimately could be the wrong shape for a consumer claim. I think what we're doing at Lindus is trying to do, or at least trying to do, is give people a clear alternative, right? So it's the same level of transparency and rigor, even for the likes of kind of RX to OTC switch, but with kind of pragmatic right sides and often decentralized and designs that are actually built for supplements or self-care or OTC products specifically. So once teams see that option laid out, it's refreshing. Very few actually want to go back to the old model, which is why we kind of see the kind of repeat business and partnerships as opposed to one-off.
Awesome. And we've got a few comments coming in now. What I'll do is I'll just cover the key takeaways, and then the panel and I can answer some of your questions. So yeah, to briefly wrap up, I think, we've showed pretty conclusively, and I think there's general agreement that evidence equals differentiation in this space. Lower barriers to entry mean more competitors than ever flooding the market, but the brands and products that invest in differentiation really stand out, and that's what consumers are looking for. We've seen how to thread the needle between pharma grade evidence while not sacrificing costs and timelines, and how technology can be helpful in doing this, and maybe different operational models. So, the Flora study, which we did, Thomas, is a great example of how you can have the same endpoints that you'd see in a drug study, but using technology and a slightly different trial setting, we're able to run that at a cost, timeline, and price point that just makes it viable. And then some great insights from you guys on how to ensure alignment between study design and the claim you want to make. Thomas, Malcolm, any final reflections or advice maybe for the audience at either big or small companies thinking about evidence generation?
I just add one quick one for maybe companies starting out in this space. I think it's really worth being rigorous on this question. You can maybe get away with it in the early days, just doing a quick and dirty study and being a bit outlandish with your marketing, but ultimately bigger B2B partners or even larger direct-to-consumer activities will receive more scrutiny in time. And generally a quick and dirty study that's like hand wavy is not going to cut it. So in this sense, it's not just only a marketing exercise, consumer health. And I think it does really need to be firmly rooted in science to win past hype and the waves, which inevitably go. The journey is quite long. So that would be my number one piece of advice.
You echo that. I would say align science, marketing, and regulatory early. And because, as we said at the beginning, today, evidence is currency. It builds trust and competitive advantage. I think it's important that from a consumer health perspective, you can start with the claim, not the protocol, and design ultimately the kind of simplest, credible studies. But there's equity in your evidence. And I think we've demonstrated some of that today in terms of some of the tips for how to go about that based on best practice.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. So this brings us to Q&A. We've got a bunch of questions now, so I'm just going to try and to run through them in the 5 minutes we have from an anonymous attendee on, a lot of companies claim access to millions of EHRs for patient recruitment. How is Lindus Health's solution different? Simply put, our solution gives us not only the ability to search EHRs, in the case of Flora, for individuals with a recent HbA1c rating, within range, but also crucially the consent to contact those individuals to enroll them in studies. I think that's the key difference. Frankly, there's a lot of solutions out there that will give you access to anonymized EHRs, but then you can't actually contact those individuals if they happen to be eligible. And that's the key difference for us. And that's what allows us to actually contact, further screen, and then enroll these individuals in studies. So yeah. Another question here: when is a brand ready to invest in clinical validation? Maybe Thomas, I'll let you take this one.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that when you know what your product is, and that's obviously something that may constantly change to an extent, but when you're pretty sure that you're going to scale something and you're not just testing something, because trials take time and are expensive. That's one piece. The other piece is, particularly in the food and supplement space, when you have some kind of IP position that will allow you to convince stakeholders that it's worth investing in trials which don't have an immediate return on investment per se, but will eventually.
Nice.
I would add to that. I would say when the claim is kind of central to your story as a brand. So, if you're asking people to trust you on a functional benefit like gut or sleep or mood or immunity, for example, and you plan to scale or premiumize, then you're ready. The risk of not having evidence becomes bigger ultimately than the cost of generating it. So, in my perspective, at least.
Cool. Someone asks, what is your average dropout rate in decentralized trials? So I can answer this. So the Flora trial wasn't actually fully decentralized. We had some aspects that were remote and then other aspects like the blood tests that were done in person. It just worked out easier that way. And actually, as an aside, I often find that a hybrid design can be most impactful, because realistically, not every study, even in the consumer health space, is right to be decentralized. But anyway, to actually answer your question, so for a full DCT study, I don't believe we've ever seen less than 88% retention, if I'm not mistaken, over like a 6-month period. We routinely run 3 6-month studies with 95+% adherence and retention, particularly where those studies involve like ePro primary endpoints. So yeah, and there's a bunch of strategies that probably be a whole separate webinar on, what you can do to keep that retention high. But in short, there's lots of touch points with people over calls with our trial nurses. We have micropayments where we can pay out patients depending on how many ePro surveys they answer, how many trial visits they attend. We have newsletters that are IRB and ethics committee approved that remind patients of the importance of what they're doing or remind participants. So lots of strategies, and happy to go into those. Probably one last question before we wrap, and we'll answer the others by email. But Guillermo, apologies for the pronunciation, asks, does a clinical trial run for EFSA? Is it also valid for the FDA? Maybe Thomas, do you want to start, and I can jump in as well?
Sure. Short answer is yes. And I think that kind of harks back to what I was saying about the EFSA standard being as conservative as we've seen. If you adhere to their standards, then generally speaking, it's going to be good enough for the FDA. Obviously, there might be small details there in very specific cases that are different, but broadly speaking, yes. And it just comes down to gold standard clinical grade evidence.
Perfect. Well, with that, we're at time, so I'll finish up there. Thank you very much, Thomas and Malcolm, for joining us. Thank you all to your audience for your time and your questions. So thank you again, and look forward to catching up with you guys in the near future.